Money is essential to the way the economy operates, but it's also at the heart of its many problems. So what is the money problem? Welcome to part 2 in our series Fixing Our Economy. This is where we're looking at the British economy through these images that I've created, which explain a lot of what's going on. And as I say, today we're talking about money. And just a quick recap on where we got to in the last episode. So we started out by saying that wealth is that which improves and sustains the quality of our lives. And a large proportion of that wealth is stuff that we do fundamentally for ourselves. So for example, if you imagine the wealth of a doctor, a surgeon who's fixing a heart, open heart surgery, that's obviously creating a lot of wealth. It's fixing somebody who was previously very ill. But if we imagine also that we could go for a walk every day, if we had the time and if we had the opportunity, and by going for a walk every day, we would improve our health and we wouldn't need open heart surgery, then are we creating wealth in that way? And I would say, yes, of course we are. That's also wealth. It's the equivalent wealth. Although one has got a large sum of money attached to it, if you like, in the expense of having a surgeon do open heart surgery, and the other one is something we do for ourselves for free. So it's rather different. And then there's the fact that going for a walk not only improves our health, but it's also enjoyable in itself. So the action of going for a walk is enjoyable. That's creating wealth in our lives too. So it's a sort of double benefit, if you like. There's the increased health and there's the enjoyment of the walk. So this says something about wealth creation that's really important, which is that most wealth that really matters in our lives, we actually create for ourselves. And a big part of what the economy needs to do is sort of get out of our way and allow us to create wealth for ourselves. And money's a big thing that's preventing us from doing that, as we're going to discover. So what that tells us is that the standard economic model, the model of supply and demand and all that doesn't really work. That's not really what's going on. That's a sort of construct, which is true of certain parts of the economy, but it's not the core of economic activity. But even if it were, even if we looked at the economy in the more conventional sense, there's still a huge part of it which is not actually anything to do with money. So this image here, for example, this shows the economy in money terms, in money values, but the left-hand section, the green section, is all unpaid work, and the red section on the right is paid work. And the unpaid work, even in this way, is about 3/8 of the total. So there's a huge amount of work that we're doing for nothing. We're doing because we choose to. And although it may not be the work that we want to do, it may not be enjoyable in the sense of a walk in the park, it's still really, really important. And it is among the most valuable and useful work that we do because we choose to do it. And if it weren't valuable and useful and essential, then we wouldn't choose to do it. And that's things like care for children and adults, it's things like cleaning, and it's things like DIY and gardening and all those sorts of things, cooking meals, all those sort of things that make our lives livable and which we probably enjoy also in our lives, some of them at least, and which make our lives work, so to speak, and those of our communities too, because volunteering is in there as well. So all of that is very valuable, and that is there, as I say, on the green side of this. So even in the, so to speak, money economy, if we put a money value on these things, we can still see that the economy only really works when a large part of it is unpaid. So in principle, as I say, the role of the economic system is to get out of our way and allow us to create wealth in our lives for ourselves. And if money's not helping with that, then that's part of the problem. And to get a sort of picture of this, we can look at some very simple economic systems. For example, hunter-gatherer communities, of which there are still a few in the world in obscure parts, where people live off the abundance of the land. They find what they need and they sustain their lives in that way through the natural abundance of the natural world. Nobody stores a whole load of stuff in that situation. As they say, if they have a surplus, they store their surplus in the bodies of their brothers and sisters because that's the best place to put it. And if there's plenty to go around, then the idea of owning a surplus is slightly odd because if I've got a basket of blackberries I've taken off the hedgerow and you can just as easily get a basket of blackberries from a hedgerow, then you're not going to want my basket. So in a sense, the ownership is neither here nor there. So it's not about ownership, it's sort of about sharing. I look after you, you look after me, and ultimately we're going to be all right if we've got enough to go around. But the modern economy is not at all like that. The modern economy has shifted completely. The modern economy is actually all about ownership. Everything is now owned by somebody pretty much, apart from the air that we breathe. And in fact, we can see that in this image here, which is a new one in the series. And what this shows is the ownership of the UK economy. And what we have on the left, the orange section there, that is actually buildings. And the middle section, the big green section, is land underneath buildings. It's land rather than buildings, in other words. And then here we have financial assets, bank accounts and stocks and shares and that sort of thing. And here the little sort of blue slither on the right is what you might call material goods. It's sort of stuff that we own. Not a very big part of the total, as you can see, because we're so dominated by these sorts of assets like land and homes and financial assets. And then around the outside, this little red circle, or thin red circle around the outside, that is stuff which is not owned by households, not owned by people, because all of this is owned by individuals. And there's this tiny little strip around the outside which is owned by other institutions. And those institutions are the government, which owns absolutely nothing pretty much because its debts are bigger than what it owns. And it's sold off over the last 40 years most of the shared assets that we had. And then it's companies. Companies own a certain amount. They don't earn that much because companies themselves are owned by private individuals, ultimately through themselves directly or through funds. So a little bit there represents what companies own in their own right. That would be the value of a company's assets in excess of its share value, for example. So that's all about ownership. This shows that everything pretty much in the UK is owned by an individual, directly or indirectly. Everything, as I say, apart from the air that we breathe, and even the air that we breathe is probably not that clean because the pollution in the air is coming from these activities. So that's what's happening. That's what the UK economy looks like. That's what ownership looks like. And how did we get there? How did we get from those very simple hunter-gatherer type communities which didn't need ownership to a situation where ownership is absolutely central to everything we do? And the answer is, well, two things. First of all, surpluses, and secondly, the increase in the population. And those two things are related because as technologies like agriculture and technologies around how you store the products of agriculture, how those things came into play, much more food could be produced. Excess food allowed people to do jobs that weren't food production, but other things like building and art and crafts and 100 other things. So all that sort of activity started to create huge surpluses. And of course, when you've got a surplus, the tendency is for the population to rise as well, because for two reasons. First of all, people want to have children, and if they can do so, if they've got a surplus of resources. And secondly, of course, in a population where a lot of people are involved in creating the wealth, particularly of agriculture, you need more people to do that. And so having more children is a good idea. So the population increases to reflect what the economy is capable of producing in terms of supporting people. And then, of course, you've got a new thing coming in, which is that we're not now talking about absolute abundance. We're not talking about there just being plenty to go around. We're talking about sufficiency. We're talking about saying we've got enough. We've got enough people and enough wealth. The two are balanced out and there's enough for everybody to be reasonably well off. And that's fine, except that once you're talking about enough rather than absolute abundance, you've got a problem of who owns the enough. Because if somebody's got far too much, effectively, then somebody else is going to have far too little. And that's what's going on in the economy, because naturally enough, it's not evenly distributed and it tends to become less well distributed over time. So we've got a massive imbalance of ownership. This just shows total ownership. Doesn't say anything about who owns what. We'll look at that later. But it obviously is not all owned in an even way. And money is at the heart of that. Money is the main reason why wealth is so unevenly distributed. So let's start by talking about money. And first of all, what is money? Well, there's the myth and there's the reality. So let's just have a look at the myth. Well, the myth says that money has intrinsic value. The myth says that money is attached to something that has equivalent value to the thing that you might be using it for. So, for example, in the old days, it was said that Roman soldiers were paid in salt because salt had really substantial value at that time. Well, that apparently is a myth, not the case at all. But we do know that, for example, in the 19th century, the British government issued money in solid gold, gold sovereigns, which contained a pound's worth of gold. and they were used throughout the 19th century. They were widely used as a form of currency. But actually, a piece of gold, whether it's a sovereign or anything else, is not really a coin, it's a piece of gold. And actually, a lot of the British sovereigns that were issued in the 19th century were melted down and used as gold, as the material, because people knew they were pure and they contained a certain quantity. So a sovereign, a piece of gold, is a lump of gold, and if you're buying something with it, that's not really a money transaction, that's a sort of barter, it's an exchange. You're saying, here, look, I've got a piece of gold, you've got whatever I want, we'll exchange the two as a form of barter, value for value. So that's the myth. Now the reality is that money doesn't have any intrinsic value. It's pretty much in the nature of money that it has no value at all. And if we look at, for example, money in circulation in Great Britain, in the United Kingdom today, well, this image here gives us the picture, because this little red bit on the side, that's all the notes and coins that are in circulation. And all the rest of it, all that big blue chunk of the credit card, so to speak, that is all invented money. It's all money which has been created by just entering numbers into a computer on a keyboard. That's not real money at all. And at least this money here, the red section, the notes and coins, at least that's something tangible. It doesn't have any real value. It's only paper or base metal, but at least it has something which you can see. And it's been made, it's been created, and somebody has presumably counted up the amount of it. Whereas all the rest of it, the big blue section, in a sense, it's not been made at all. It's completely nothing. It's just a sort of thing in the ether which allows us to do transactions. So that's the reality about money. Money doesn't really have any actual substance at all. And if that's the case about money, well, where does that money come from? And there again, we've got myth and we've got reality, because the myth says that somehow that money is created by economic activity. The myth says, for example, that in industry or business or whatever, we are making money, that people who are doing economic activity are making money. They are putting money into the economy. But of course, that's not the case in reality. So if I'm lucky enough to find a lump of gold in the Welsh mountainside, or if I make a beautiful table, or I grow a field full of crops, I'm not making money, I'm making something completely different. I'm discovering gold, or I'm making a table, or I'm making a field of crops. And those things I can exchange for money, but they are not money. They are, again, items that can be bartered, can be exchanged for other items, and money just comes into the picture because it's a means of exchange that they can be exchanged for. So nobody's making money. Nobody's making money in the real economy. The only way money is getting into the economy if somebody puts it there who can do so with the authority to say, here's something with absolutely no value, but we're going to use it as a means of exchange. And that somebody, of course, is the state, because all the money in the economy comes from the state. It's possible that it allows other institutions, such as commercial banks, for example, to assist it in the process of putting money into the economy, but nonetheless the right to put money into the economy lies exclusively with the state. All money comes from the government. And until we understand that, we can't really get a handle on how this whole thing works. Because if we continue to believe that we are making money, that money has intrinsic value, that money somehow is the reality of value in the economy, then we're going to go on making mistakes about how the economy works. So all money is created by the state, and that actually gives us the term fiat currency, where fiat is not an Italian brand of car, it's actually the Latin for a Beatles record, Let It Be, because fiat currency means let it be currency, let it be money. And that's what governments do. They say, let this be money, let this be worth something, and because we believe in the government, more or less, we accept that, and the government can reinforce that let it be money by insisting that all their taxes are paid in that money. And that means people have to have that money, and they have ultimately to trust it in some way. If money has no intrinsic value, then how do we go about working out what it's worth? Well, the answer lies in what it can buy. And what it can buy ultimately is the work of people. Now, it's not exclusively that. It can also buy other things which occur in the natural world, but leaving that aside for a moment, and we will come back to that later, money essentially is buying the work of people. And that's really important distinction, because we've tended to think about that the other way around. We've tended to think that money gives value to the work of people, when the reality is that the work of people gives value to money. Money can only have value because it can be exchanged for something that somebody's willing to do for you. And they will do that thing for you because they can exchange their work in effect for the work of somebody else. So the work of a baker can be exchanged, for example, for the work of a farmer growing carrots or whatever it might be. So people exchange their work, and money is only the intermediary in that. And therefore, money is not giving work value, work is giving money value. Work is the thing which has value in the economy. Money of itself does not have value. And that's really, really important because we tend to think of it the other way around, as I say. But if we think about something like, I don't know, the NHS, and we say, how much money do we want to spend on the NHS? And the government budget is how much money is allocated to the NHS. Well, that's really completely the wrong way of looking at it. Because what we should be saying is, how much work do we want to allocate to the NHS? How much of our capacity for work as people do we want to spend on health services? Bearing in mind that the more time we involve ourselves working for health services, the less time we can be working for something else. And that's crucially important because it is all about what we want to do and what we value in the terms of what we can do. So money isn't value, it's people's work that is value. It's people's work that creates wealth, and money is the oil in the machine. It's what allows the machine to turn better, and it's what allows people to create wealth more efficiently. But money isn't flowing all the time. One of the great things about money is that it can allow people to hang on to it, to use it another day. And in that way, it becomes a sort of surrogate for ownership, because money actually completely solves the problem of ownership. So if you imagine you're a rich person, lots of stuff, and you want to have lots of options in the future for what you might want, then you're going to have stores of loads of things, because you don't know what you're going to need and when you're going to need it. But money completely fixes that problem, because you don't need a store of anything if you've got money. You can just buy what you want when you want it. So a rich man doesn't need a great big granary to store all his grain, doesn't need to transact all that grain, doesn't need to find somebody to trade it with when he wants something else. He just turns the grain into money by selling the whole lot at the outset, and then the money can be spent whenever he wants. So money is doing two jobs. It's oiling the wheels of the economy, making it turn better, making it easier to produce real wealth, but it's also acting as a sort of store for surpluses of resources. And those two functions are actually at odds, because the more money that's being used as that sort of store, the more money that's being held back in anticipation of purchases in the future, then the less money is available to oil the wheels of the economy. And as those stores, as the money held back increases, then the economy is likely to grind more slowly, because the money is simply not there to make it produce the wealth that people need. So this is where the problem of ownership comes into focus, because the ownership we're talking about is the ownership of resources, which are what people need to create wealth in their lives. And money is acting as a sort of proxy for ownership. It becomes a sort of super resource. It's a resource which is infinitely flexible. And as such, it makes the problem of ownership much more difficult to deal with, as we're about to see. The problem with ownership is that it is inherently wasteful. We can sort of see that when we look at the possessions we have in our lives and the use we make of them. For example, if you've got a lawnmower, it's probably in use for about 1% of its life. If you've got a car, probably in use for about 10% of its life on average. So we can see that were we able to share these things, even though we would need some redundancy, we'd need some overcapacity, but were we able to share things more effectively, then the amount of resource we would need to put in to certain things would be much less, and then we would have more left over for other forms of wealth. So we are reducing the amount of wealth in our lives through sheer wastage because we have too much. But there's also something about ownership being only valuable if we can use what we have. Because the mere ownership itself doesn't impart anything. If I've got a room full of coats, for example, and I only ever wear one of them, then all the others don't really represent wealth at all. They're just sitting there. But that room full of coats could be depriving other people of having a coat to keep them warm. or I might have a library of books and somebody else hasn't got any books at all, or whatever. The point is that you've only got wealth coming from something when you're using it. If you're not able to read a book, then you're not getting wealth from owning it. If somebody hasn't got a book, then they can't generate the wealth that would come from reading it, and so it goes on. Wealth and use are closely related. Wealth and ownership are less closely related. And the same problem actually exists around money, because money is this sort of, as I say, this sort of super resource. But if you've got so much of it that you don't know what to do with it, so to speak, then that is thoroughly wasted. And if you haven't got enough of it and you can't create wealth, then that waste really matters, because the money needs to be where it can create wealth. So the problem of money, therefore, flows directly from the problem of ownership. If ownership is wasteful, then the situation around money is inherently wasteful. And that's not to say that people don't need more than the minimum. I'm not suggesting for a moment that everybody should be on the breadline. Nobody should have more than the absolute minimum that they require. Having plenty, having abundancy is incredibly valuable. We need security in our lives. We need to feel comfortable. We need to feel that we know where tomorrow's wealth is coming from as well as today's. There's all sorts of things beneficial about having enough, about having what we need. But nonetheless, we need to notice that having too much is problematic because it prevents other people from having anything. And also we need to notice that that's particularly acute in the case of money, because money is a super resource, money is infinitely flexible, and money behaves in all sorts of ways that actual physical goods like books and coats and other things don't. To summarize the problem of money, which has been the story of this whole video, to summarize that, we would say that money can accumulate to an unlimited extent. Unlike consumer goods, there is no limit on the amount of money that somebody who is able to accumulate money can accumulate. And to make matters worse, money accumulates to itself. So people who've got excess money, people who've got money that they're simply not able to use to create real wealth in their life, money that they're not spending, in other words, or won't spend or can't spend, that money accumulates more money to itself in rents and dividends and interest and capital gains and all the ways in which people who have money accumulate more. And of course, the more that happens, the more money is stored away. It's used as this sort of super resource which is piled up somewhere and can't be used to generate wealth in the real economy. But very few people will say they've got too much money and put it back into the economy, because there's no real mechanism for doing that. The government has its taxation, for example, but that doesn't really impact on these huge accumulations of money which are creating the problem. Because there are two things about wealth that we need to look at. First of all, well, what is wealth? And we've seen here that wealth exists in things like land and buildings and financial assets, and very little of it actually exists in sort of real things that improve the quality of our lives. And secondly, this image here says absolutely nothing in this picture of a beach ball, if you like, which says anything about who owns that wealth. And to get that, well, we need to look at this image here, which I created for Christmas, and don't worry about the presents at the bottom. Look at the top, the row of baubles, and what that shows is the distribution of money wealth across the economy. That's 10% of the population in each bauble. And you can see we can hardly see the one at the bottom, and that the one at the top is bigger significantly than all the rest. So it's massively badly distributed, and a lot of the wealth here could make a big difference to what's going on down here. And this, we've used the word wealth to describe that because that's the word the government would use, that's the word the statisticians would use. That's wealth in one sense. But the real problem we've got is the word wealth has two meanings. We started out this whole series by saying that wealth is that which sustains and improves the quality of our lives. And that can be created in all sorts of ways that we may do for ourselves or we may do through the money economy. But for the government, wealth is much more like that or like this. Wealth is all that stuff that we've stored up. And that's completely different. Now, since all money comes from the government, this is undoubtedly a problem that the government can solve. But it does also come down to the question of whether the government wants to solve it and whether it understands how to solve it. And until we find out which of those two definitions of wealth the government is going to run with, or until we can persuade the government to run with a definition of wealth that really reflects what we want and need in our lives, then that problem is just going to get worse and worse. So thanks for watching. Do please press the like button if you've enjoyed this video, because that makes a huge difference. And please also do subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. And many thanks if you have. Do also check out the website at bonkerseconomics.net. And just also to say that you can buy postcards of these images, or many of them. They're available in packets of 16 on the website. They're not expensive, and they do make quite good conversation openers talking about the economy with your family and friends. Thanks very much.